In our first project, we're going to combine these two photographs, a soccer player taken in the studio, same one you saw in the video early on about lighting, and then a photograph taken outside. Now the only thing that's kind of slightly unusual in this particular case is when I took this background photograph, I was kind of imagining this soccer player, Darren. So I took the photograph, this one, and I deliberately put it out of focus as if I was focusing on a subject in the forefront and the depth of field was putting the background information a little out of focus. And part of the reason, frankly, is there were wires, electrical wires up in the sky that I found a little distracting, and I think the soccer net was kind of facing the wrong way, so I just kind of tried to make it a little bit blurry, and also it's a little darker because the photograph itself was darker. These are both raw files, so we'll start off by opening our background file. Now here's something I don't think I really mentioned during the class, but if the photo you're going to use as your background is a camera raw file, then it just makes sense to also open that as a camera raw smart object so you can make ongoing adjustments to it. So for now I'm just going to darken the exposure just a little bit, got the clarity up a little bit, and the vibrance up a little bit as well. And then we're going to open object. Remember, that's because this is on Open in Photoshop as Smart Object. So if you don't have that already on, make sure you click on that link looking thing down here and turn that on. And once you've got that on, it'll stay on from now on. That was a lot of ons in one sentence. But anyway, so we're going to open this as our background image. Now we need to get our soccer player in here as a camera raw smart object. So as we saw earlier, there's multiple ways to do this. I'm going to suggest we go back to Bridge and then use File, Place in Photoshop. It will still open first in Camera Raw, and this is where we want to make adjustments. Now, as you saw in that video on lighting, this photo was taken deliberately to be kind of dramatic, but to make life a little easier for my quick selection tool and refine edge, I'm going to push the exposure up because I really want to make sure I can see some distinction between his hair and the background. So I'm going to push these up just a little bit. I don't really need to push the highlights up though for now. That should do something around there. I just want to make sure I don't blow out anything else so much that then I won't be able to find that. And I click OK. Now as we know, this is a camera raw smart object, which means it's going to create a link back and forth. I think he's a little big, so I'm going to hold down Shift and scale him down just a little bit like this, so he's kind of in the foreground. Now one of the things they teach you in photography is don't put someone dead center because it doesn't make for very interesting looking photographs, so we're going to move him just slightly off center like this. So now we have our two camera raw smart objects, and that gives us the benefit that on the one hand we can work with our selection and update the look of our soccer player, but also have a separate smart object for the background. One of the things I find usually helps is if you're working with something like the quick selection tool, hide the background temporarily just so we're really focusing our attention on our soccer player. And now we're just kind of drag around with the quick selection tool. This might actually have been a candidate for me to drag on the background instead and then inverse it, but I think it'll be pretty much the same. We just have to make sure we're not leaving out any information here. Now I can see there's little tiny pieces of string from the laces. I'm going to worry about those separately later on. For now I'm just trying to get as accurate as I can. I got a little too much down here, so we're going to hold down Option Alt and remove that. And here, get the rest of as much as I can with his hair. And I'm not expecting to be able to get every little bit, but I want to get fairly close, especially when our subject, like in this case, Darren, has very short hair. Someone has longer hair, like flowing in the wind, then I would try to not potentially get quite as much and let the fine edge do its job. Here I press Q for quick mask just to do a quick check to make sure I didn't miss anything. I think I cut off a little bit of his hair there, but otherwise that looks pretty good. So now before I go to refine edge, we're going to show the background layer again. So as we know by now, because I've said it 1,000 times, we want to look at him in the context of the new background. The hard part here is we need to not be distracted by the fact that he's way too bright for the background and really just look at the edges to see how we're doing. So I'm going to zoom in a little bit, Command or Control plus, and then use the space bar so I can get the hand tool. And as always, the main thing I'm worried about is his hair. Because he doesn't have a lot of hair, I don't think that I would try to use Smart Radius, because I think the chances are it will do not so nice things to the hard edges that I want. So I probably would not do that in this case. What I would do is with our Refine Radius tool, the really small brush, just paint around the very edge, just trying to get a few more little hairs. And whenever I do that, I usually do a quick look on the black and white, and that's not bad. I mean, it's got a little too much gray in there, but we can work with that. I'm not worried about the fact that I can't see the laces here, because that would be too hard to get right at this moment. So for now, I'm just looking at it as it looks here. If you are concerned about any kind of little fringe, then you could move this slightly. I don't think I need to a whole lot in this case, because I think it's got a pretty nice separation. And of course, I want to make sure I'm outputting to a layer mask. Now, before I do anything else, including making decisions about his hair, I want to get him looking more like we want. So I'm going to double click, go back. One of the things I usually do is right away come in here and just go back to camera raw defaults. That'll put it back the way it was when I took the photograph. And before we do anything else, let's just see what that looks like. It's actually not bad. I think I want him a little brighter, but I just want to see what that looked like at that point. So let's go back and just push the exposure just a little bit. And if you want to get kind of, and I don't really like using the term HDR, but an HDR-like effect, then put the clarity up, especially when you have a male athlete where you want it to look maybe a little grittier, then that's not a bad thing to do. You could even lower the saturation just a hair. So something like that. So all I'm doing is I've got the exposure pushed up just a little bit. Maybe let's put the contrast up just a bit too. This is obviously to taste, so you can adjust, and there's nothing wrong with. In fact, I usually take 2 or 3 trips back and forth until I decide, yeah, I kind of like the way that looks right there. Now here's an example of times where you can make your life simpler based on decisions you make. For example, his hair right now, I can see, because it's up against the sky, I can see where it doesn't look quite as good. If we moved him to a position on the photograph where he was right in front of some trees that are dark, it might not be quite as obvious. So that's another thing you can do. You don't have to necessarily spend tons of time fixing hair when the solution might be, gosh, if I moved him that way just a little bit, it would look better already. So here's our layer mask. I just hit Option or Alt-click to see what it looks like, and we can see we definitely need a bit of help on his hair. But as I mentioned earlier, I would Option click again because I want to see it in the context of my background. So I'm going to take my paintbrush, B for brush. I've got a giant size brush, so I need to use my left bracket key to get it much, much smaller. I want white as my foreground color. You can always press X to switch to white. And I would do a couple things. I would lower the opacity and change our blend mode to that overlay. As I mentioned in the earlier class, there are keyboard shortcuts for those. You can just press 6 or 7 for the amount of percentage of opacity, and then Option Shift O or Alt Shift O for overlay mode. And then I'm going to make my brush a little smaller, and I want to get, the key thing to me is I don't want to leave gaps in the middle of his head. So I want to make sure that part's there, and then up here I'm just going to kind of go over very slightly. Now this is a more challenging one than it appears because his hair was quite dark against a dark background. So the quick selection tool struggles there a little bit more than it would if, for example, he was on a white background or a light background. So let's take another quick look. It's not too bad. I think I want to go a little more over this edge here. Now the other decision that we can make in this case, I'm still not happy with the way this is looking. So another option I can try, I'm going to switch to my hard edge brush and put it back to normal and 100%. Use a smaller brush, switch my foreground color to black, and it's going to come in and kind of try to trim off some of those little tiny bits that are bugging me. I know right now you're thinking, really, that doesn't look much better. kind of looks worse. Well, that's because I'm not finished yet. And then we would go back and do our little hair trick where I'm just going to take my paintbrush, go to my 1 or 2 pixel brush, go in here, shape dynamics, fade. That fade is maybe a little too low, so maybe 40 something. That looks a little better to me. Okay, so now I've got a new layer. I'm going to Option Alt click, and all I'm going to do is just paint some of those little hairs in there. In this case, I think I might have even gone a little too high on the fade. Now, one thing that is not a bad idea, this is sort of a little bonus technique, I didn't mention this earlier. I did mention that I don't want you to spend too much time zoomed in really close and looking at it further away, but sometimes that becomes a bit of a pain and you're having to constantly zoom in and zoom back out again. So here's a nice little trick. We go to the window menu, Arrange, and choose New Window for whatever the name of your document is. Then we go back to Arrange and choose Tile. And what will happen is on one side we can zoom in, and on the other side we're kind of seeing it in the context of our zoom amount, the final product. Now it's the same image, so if I make some change over here, not that we would do this of course, but just so you can see, if I did a brush stroke, you see how it instantly shows up on the other side. So that's just a nice way to, when you're worried about does this look realistic or not, any change that you make on one image is going to automatically show in the second view. So it's just 2 views of the same document. Now in this particular case, I think the last thing I would do to try to make this look a little more realistic is there's clearly a light source coming from this side on his face, so I want to kind of emulate that a bit. So I'd go to my background layer, add a curves adjustment layer, and I'm going to brighten things up. And right now, of course, is going to brighten everything up. However, adjustment layers do come with a layer mask. So I take my gradient tool, got the regular gradient going from black to white. And this means wherever I paint, initially I'll say don't brighten this part and then gradually brighten it. So here, for example, I'd start somewhere around here. Say I want this whole side of this to be darker. So I'm just going to drag in like this, and you'll see what happens is it now means this side of the document is just a little bit lighter. It's subtle, but you can see it's more emulating the fact that if there was light coming from here. And I think just for the sake of argument, I want to move him just a little bit over, something like that. Now, I just realized that the one thing I didn't do was address our issue with the little strings here from the laces. So let's take a look at that. Shift click on the layer mask to hide it. Then I would use a tool like the polygonal lasso tool just because it's easier. Go a little closer in, and then I'm just going to kind of trace over this, and then hold down the Shift key so I can start the second one, and then let go and trace over this one. And then when I say trace over, I mean I'm doing a series of single clicks. With the polygonal lasso tool, anytime you want to change direction, you do another click. And I'm just making sure that I'm going far enough in that I'm overlapping. Now, if I shift click on the layer mask again, make sure you click on the layer mask, and then I want to fill it with white. White is my background color, so Command Delete or Control Backspace will fill with white. And then I've got my little laces there, which look better. They're kind of lost a little bit in the background, but I still want to make sure I just captured them to show you how you can tweak a mask manually on top of the other work we've done. Now, if this is a real project, I would save this as a Photoshop file, which will preserve the Camera Raw Smart Objects and every other work I've done, the masking, everything else like that, and then I can go back in and tweak it. If you need to, you can save a copy as a JPEG or whatever you want, but I would always preserve this layered document so you can continue to work on it.